It started with the sound of laughter, high-pitched and echoing through the early morning haze like nails on glass. At first, I thought it was something from the neighbor's yard, maybe their dog chasing the kids again. But as I stepped out onto my deck with a mug of coffee in hand, the laughter grew louder, sharper, and unmistakably closer. That's when I saw them, 3 kids I barely recognized, splashing and screaming with delight in the middle of my pool. Pool toys floated around like they owned the place, one kid doing cannonballs while another dunked a third who shrieked at the top of her lungs. My first instinct was confusion, a flicker of disbelief that maybe, just maybe, I'd forgotten some promise or community arrangement. But I knew better. I didn't invite them. I didn't even know their names. Then I spotted her. Reclined like royalty on one of my lounge chairs, wearing oversized sunglasses and sipping an iced coffee like it was her private spa day, sat Karen. Not just any Karen, but the Karen. The one who ran the HOA like it was her kingdom and we were her peasants. She glanced up casually as I walked toward her and gave me a small wave, like I was an annoying housefly buzzing too close to her drink. I stopped at the edge of the pool, took a deep breath, and asked the only logical question I could think of at that moment: why are your kids in my pool? Karen didn't even flinch. Oh, it's just for a little while, she said smoothly, pushing her sunglasses up her nose. They've been so cooped up lately, and with the community pool being cleaned, they needed a break. Don't worry, they'll be out soon. Her tone had the dismissive confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around her. I blinked at her, trying to absorb the sheer audacity. This isn't a public pool, I said, gesturing broadly. It's in my backyard. There's a locked gate. How did they even get in? She smiled as if I'd complimented her ingenuity. Oh, they hopped the fence. Kids are so resourceful. Resourceful. That was the word she used. Like this was a clever little prank, not blatant trespassing. I tried again, this time firmer. You need to get them out. Now. This is private property. Her smile dropped slightly, but only for a moment. You're being a bit dramatic, she said, standing up and brushing invisible lint from her linen pants. They are just kids. It's summer. Let them enjoy it. Isn't that what neighbors are for? I didn't argue further. I went back inside, locked my doors, and pulled up my security footage. I scrubbed through the feed and found exactly what I expected: Karen ushering her kids through a gap in the side fence where a neighbor's tool shed backed up near my property. She knew what she was doing. This wasn't some spontaneous splash session. It had happened before, on days I wasn't home. A quick scroll through older footage confirmed it. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time I caught her in the act. Later that afternoon, after her kids had finally dried off and been corralled out of my yard, I submitted a formal complaint to the HOA. I uploaded the footage, documented the trespassing, and even included screenshots of my private property and no trespassing signs that had clearly been ignored. I expected a swift response, something like, "This is unacceptable," or "We'll address this immediately." Instead, I got a reply from the HOA chair, a man named Howard, who always seemed to cower when Karen raised her voice, saying, "This seems to be a misunderstanding. Karen mentioned that your pool could be considered a shared community resource in times of community facility maintenance. We suggest working it out neighbor to neighbor." I laughed out loud when I read that. A shared community resource? My pool? Built and paid for with my own savings? On my property, maintained by me, heated by my solar panels, and insured under my name? I called Howard and left a voicemail demanding clarification. I followed up with an email stating that there was no clause in the HOA agreement that made private pools public property. No response. Over the next few days, Karen's kids returned. Again and again. Always when I was busy on calls or in virtual meetings, thinking I could relax in the safety of my own home. Each time, I'd chase them out, only to hear Karen later complaining loudly over the fence to other neighbors about how uptight I was, how I hated children, and how he acts like he's better than everyone just because he has a pool. Word spread, but in a twisted version of events that painted me as the villain. A few neighbors gave me side eyes. One even said, They are just kids, man. Let them cool off. As if that was justification for invading someone's space uninvited. I installed a taller gate. Karen's kids climbed over it. I placed a sign saying "Do not enter, surveillance active." Karen wrote Grinch on it in pink chalk. One day I caught one of the kids peeing in the shallow end, and that was the final straw. I didn't yell. I didn't rant. I just stared at the mess, cleaned it up, and walked back inside. Something shifted in me that day. Not anger. Not revenge. Just resolve. Karen clearly wasn't going to stop. The HOA was useless. Logic had failed. So maybe it was time for creativity. That night, I sat at my desk and began researching. I typed into the search bar, "Can a swimming pool be converted into an ice rink?" The results were more promising than I expected. There were professional cooling systems designed for temporary winter skating rinks, even in warmer climates. Expensive, sure, but not out of reach. I imagined the look on Karen's face when her kids came to swim and instead found a sheet of glistening ice stretching from end to end. I smiled. Let her try and spin that to the HOA. I made a few calls. Found a company that specialized in rink installations for off-season training. Booked a consultation. Told no one. Not even the few neighbors who were still on my side. The plan wasn't just about stopping Karen. It was about reclaiming my space with a kind of poetic finality. She wanted to abuse summer privileges? Fine. I'd bring in winter early. Let's see how resourceful her kids really were when faced with a 30-foot sheet of frozen revenge. And so the countdown began. A few more days of pool hopping and entitled whining. Then the chill would come. Not just in the air, but in the neighborhood dynamic itself. Because once Karen realized she could no longer control the narrative, the gate, or the water, she'd finally understand what happens when you ignore the warning signs too many times. The installation began on a quiet Thursday morning. Karen wasn't around, or if she was too distracted to notice the three-man crew rolling in industrial-grade hoses, coils of insulated piping, and an unmarked white truck carrying the core of the cooling system. I greeted them casually, keeping everything discreet. No loud announcements, no banners, no hint of what was coming. I offered coffee and made sure they parked in a way that blocked the view from the street. The lead technician, a guy named Brad who looked like he spent his off-time building snow forts, nodded approvingly at my setup. "You're not the first guy we've done this for in a revenge scenario," he said with a knowing grin. "But this might be the funniest." I didn't explain the full story. Just enough to get the work done. The process was surprisingly fast. They laid out the foundation that would sit inside the pool's basin, a semi-flexible base layer designed to distribute coolant evenly. The piping network went in next, coiled tight and wrapped beneath a layer of insulating material that would later be covered with a plastic composite to form the skating surface. Then came the generator and the chiller system itself, housed neatly beside the pool shed. It looked like a compact air conditioning unit, but it could drop water temperature faster than nature ever could. They assured me the ice would form overnight. I paid the bill up front and watched as they drove off, leaving behind what looked like an ordinary empty pool, at least for now. That evening, I stood on the edge of the deck, staring down into what had once been a symbol of annoyance and invasion. For the first time in weeks, it felt like I was back in control. I turned on the system, heard the low hum of power surging through the coils, and went inside without looking back. By morning, the transformation was complete. The pool shimmered under a layer of fresh, solid ice. The surface was smooth, reflective, and mesmerizing. It didn't just look real, it looked majestic. I set up a few orange cones, partly for safety, partly for dramatic effect, and waited. As expected, it didn't take long. Around 10 a.m., the usual screams returned. The familiar sound of sandals slapping pavement. The giggles of kids who believed the world owed them a free pool day. I didn't move. I let them make their entrance. From my upstairs window, I watched Karen's two oldest kids run toward the pool area, towels slung around their necks, already in swimsuits. They pushed open the side gate, not bothering to knock or call, and bolted straight toward the ice. One of them threw off their towel mid-sprint and launched into what was clearly meant to be a cannonball. The resulting thud was magnificent. He bounced. Not hard enough to hurt himself, but enough to slide clumsily across the slick surface, arms flailing. His brother screamed. Not out of pain, but from the shock of seeing the water turn to ice. Both kids scrambled to their feet, stunned. I could hear one of them yelling, "What is this?" I stepped out onto the deck, coffee in hand, and casually said, "That's what happens when people can't follow simple rules." They turned to me, confused, but before they could respond, Karen arrived. She stormed through the gate seconds later, her bathrobe flying open in the breeze, sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown of chaos. "What did you do?" she shrieked, staring down at the frozen pool as if I'd committed a war crime. "They could have gotten hurt." I sipped my coffee and shrugged. "You said I was being dramatic about them swimming without permission. So I removed the water. Problem solved." Her face twisted. "You froze it," she gasped. "You turned a swimming pool into a hazard." I didn't respond. I simply walked down the steps, boots crunching lightly on the frosted edge, and said, "Funny how you suddenly care about safety. Weren't too worried when they were diving headfirst into 10 feet of water without supervision." She sputtered, trying to form a coherent argument, but nothing came out. Just outrage and disbelief. Later that day, I got the HOA email. Karen had filed a formal complaint alleging that my new ice death trap was in violation of community aesthetics, seasonal standards, and safety ordinances. I opened the file, read every word, and forwarded it to my attorney. I also attached a dozen high-resolution images of her children trespassing, climbing fences, and entering my property without permission. I made sure to highlight the timestamps. I didn't expect much from the HOA, after all, they'd already proven their loyalty to Karen, but it was worth documenting everything. The funny thing was, the neighborhood reaction was split. Some were horrified by the ice rink, claiming it was extreme. Others thought it was hilarious. A few even came by just to see it with their own eyes. One neighbor, a quiet man named Jordan who lived 2 houses down, stopped by and chuckled. "You really went full North Pole, huh?" he said. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." I smiled but said nothing. The point wasn't to impress, it was to deter. And so far, it was working. By the weekend, Karen was still fuming. Her kids sulked around the cul-de-sac like they'd lost their favorite toy. I saw them standing at the edge of their yard, staring longingly at the glimmering rink. I ignored them. That Saturday, I set up a small Bluetooth speaker and played Christmas music while sitting beside the ice with a book and a thermos of hot cocoa. Just for the atmosphere. A few kids from the block asked if they could try skating. I said not unless their parents signed waivers and scheduled time. I wasn't going to let this become another free-for-all. I'd learned my lesson. Then came Karen's next move. Late that night, I noticed someone skulking around near the edge of my yard. I checked the cameras and saw her pouring something from a plastic container onto the ice. I rushed outside, but she was gone by the time I got there. A closer inspection showed patches of salt thrown across the surface, likely in a desperate attempt to melt it. All she managed to do was ruin the top layer and corrode the piping underneath. I filed a police report and added the footage to my growing evidence archive. She had officially crossed the line, and she knew it. When I saw her the next day, she didn't even try to speak. She just stared at me with a mix of hatred and fear. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell. I simply nodded and walked away. Because at this point, words were useless. The message had been delivered. The boundaries had been set. And if she thought I was done, well, the ice was only beginning to crack. The days that followed were tense but eerily quiet. Karen's usual morning routine of unleashing her kids onto my property had stopped entirely, and for a moment, it almost felt like the neighborhood had taken a breath. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to back off quietly. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was the calm before her next tantrum. And sure enough, on Monday morning, I received an HOA summons delivered to my mailbox in a sealed envelope stamped urgent. It wasn't just another complaint. It was an official notice for a hearing, an emergency meeting requested by Karen to address what she called an ongoing danger to the welfare of neighborhood children and a deliberate campaign of hostility by a non-cooperative neighbor. The hearing was scheduled for that Thursday evening. I arrived on time, dressed neatly, with a thick folder tucked under my arm. The conference room at the HOA building was cramped, with folding chairs lined up facing a table where 3 HOA board members sat like judges. Karen was already there, flanked by 2 neighbors she had likely guilt-tripped into backing her up. She gave me a smug look as I walked in, as if this was her moment to finally put me in my place. I nodded to the board, took my seat, and waited patiently. Karen began with a performance worthy of a bad soap opera. She spoke dramatically about how her children had suffered emotional trauma from being lured into what they thought was a swimming pool only to be met with a sheet of ice like a frozen booby trap. She teared up, fake, of course, about how one of them had slipped and bruised his hip. She accused me of deliberately endangering minors, of creating a neighborhood hazard, and of weaponizing my property in a calculated vendetta against innocent families. Her voice shook as she finished with a plea that the HOA force me to return my pool to its intended use or face fines and further action. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence hang for a moment, then calmly placed my folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed photos, timestamps, copies of email correspondences with the HOA, and clear surveillance stills showing Karen's children entering my property without permission on no fewer than 8 separate occasions. I included images of her throwing salt on the rink at night, damaging equipment I had paid for, and even an HOA bylaw that stated property modifications were allowed so long as they did not violate structural integrity or cause obstruction to community access, which my rink clearly did not. When I finished presenting, I looked the board members in the eye and asked one simple question. If this had been the other way around, if I'd sent my dog to swim in Karen's pool every morning without asking, and then damaged her yard when she tried to stop me, would we even be having this meeting? That question seemed to land harder than all the documents. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Another adjusted his glasses and asked Karen if she had any documentation to counter my claims. She mumbled something about verbal agreements and neighborhood tradition, but the tone of the room had changed. The performance had ended, and reality was now sitting at the table. The hearing ended without a ruling, which was typical for HOA proceedings. They said they'd deliberate and issue a written verdict within 7 days. But the energy had shifted. Karen didn't look so confident anymore. She left in a huff, ignoring me entirely, and her backup neighbors mumbled awkward goodbyes before shuffling out. I stayed behind a few minutes longer, exchanged a few polite words with one of the board members, then headed home, half expecting retaliation by morning. What I got instead was petty in a whole new way. The next day, I woke up to find pink balloons tied along the fence separating our yards and a sign that read Community Pool Celebration, All Kids Welcome. It wasn't on my side of the fence, it was in Karen's yard, but the intent was clear. She had decided to declare herself the real queen of the cul-de-sac and was throwing a party as an act of mockery. Around noon, a group of kids arrived, music started playing, and sprinklers were turned on in what could only be described as a low-effort backyard water park. I didn't interfere. I simply watched from my deck, sipping lemonade. But I took notes. Every speaker she plugged in past the noise ordinance time, every trash bag that ended up on my lawn afterward, every unsupervised child who wandered too close to my gate. I documented it all. That evening, when the party finally wound down, I walked out to inspect the perimeter. A few candy wrappers here, a crushed juice box there. And then I found it. Someone had tried to pry open the latch on my gate. The scratches were fresh, and one of the screws had been loosened. I snapped a photo and emailed it to the HOA before bed. The next morning, I decided to escalate my own response, but not with noise or more ice. I hired a professional skating coach who had just moved into the area and was looking to build a small client base. I offered her my rink, free of charge, in exchange for giving lessons to local kids, by appointment only, with parent signatures and a strict limit on class size. She agreed immediately. By the weekend, my yard had transformed into a peaceful, orderly space where kids learned to skate under supervision, parents watched politely from benches I'd arranged near the fence, and Karen fumed from her kitchen window. The contrast was deliberate. Where her event was loud, chaotic, and borderline reckless, mine was calm, structured, and safe. More importantly, mine was legal. A local blogger even dropped by and wrote a short piece about creative suburban recreation, posting photos that conveniently cropped out Karen's yard but captured her glaring through the blinds like a cartoon villain. I didn't share the article, but I knew she saw it. That evening, the HOA issued their verdict. In a carefully worded letter, they ruled that my rink was not in violation of any regulations, that my conduct was within legal boundaries, and that the board encouraged all neighbors to respect each other's private property and avoid further escalations. Karen's complaint had officially been dismissed. I taped the letter to the inside of my front window where she could see it whenever she passed by. For the next few days, she didn't. Her car remained parked. Her kids stayed indoors. The music stopped. But I didn't feel victorious yet. Because if I knew anything about Karen, it was this: she wouldn't quit just because she lost one battle. No, she would go quiet, plan something even more dramatic, and come back louder than ever. And this time, I needed to be ready. Because something told me she wasn't just going to file more complaints or throw another party. She was going to try and make it personal. And when she did, I planned to be 10 steps ahead. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security cameras. I was half asleep, but years of dealing with Karen had sharpened my reflexes. I rolled out of bed, rubbed my eyes, and tapped the notification. The camera footage loaded, showing grainy, black and white video of someone creeping along the edge of the fence. It wasn't a kid. The figure moved slowly, cautiously, like someone who knew they were on thin ice, no pun intended. I zoomed in, and sure enough, there she was. Karen. Wearing a hoodie, crouched low, holding what looked like a bucket and a metal rod. I hit record on the feed and watched as she tiptoed around to the back of the pool, stopped, and poured the contents of the bucket over the rink. Then she took the rod and jabbed at the ice in multiple places. She was trying to crack it, maybe to render it unusable or cause an accident. I watched her slip once, catch herself, curse under her breath, and then scurry away like a thief. She had no idea every second had been caught on film. By morning, the damage was visible. Salt streaks ran across the ice in jagged, corrosive trails. One corner of the rink had softened and begun to melt irregularly. The system, which had been running perfectly for weeks, was suddenly struggling to maintain temperature consistency. I called the installation company, and the technician confirmed what I already suspected. The salt had not only disrupted the cooling layer but had also compromised a section of the pipes. Repairs would cost several $1,000s. I didn't even blink. I told them to proceed, paid the deposit, and turned my attention to Karen. I filed a police report that morning. I included screenshots, timestamps, and a flash drive of the footage. The officer on duty was skeptical at first, clearly thinking it was another neighbor spat. But when he saw the footage and the list of previous complaints and documented trespasses, his tone changed. "You've been more than patient," he said. "We'll have someone talk to her. At the very least, this qualifies as vandalism. Possibly even property damage depending on the repair cost." It wasn't an arrest, but it was a start. A formal warning on her record might finally make her realize this wasn't just a game. Karen, however, saw it differently. That evening, she showed up on my doorstep with a smug, twisted smile. She didn't knock, just stood there, waiting for me to open the door. When I did, she raised her voice instantly. "You called the cops on me," she barked. "For what? Sprinkling a little salt? I was trying to help by melting your freak show before someone broke their neck." I didn't answer. I didn't engage. I just stood there holding my phone, already recording. She noticed, narrowed her eyes, and hissed, "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you've turned this whole neighborhood against you." Then she added the real reason for her visit. "You're going to regret embarrassing me in front of the HOA. I've talked to a lawyer. You'll be hearing from mine soon. She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving behind only the echo of her heels and a storm brewing in her wake. Sure enough, a week later, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal notice of intent to sue. Karen's lawyer claimed emotional distress, child endangerment, and neighborhood defamation. The letter was absurdly dramatic, filled with exaggerated statements like our client's children are now afraid to go outdoors and the defendant created an environment of targeted psychological hostility. I took the letter to my own attorney, a no-nonsense guy named Davis, who read it, chuckled once, and said, "She's bluffing. These are scare tactics. She wants you to cave." I didn't. In fact, I doubled down. We filed a countersuit. It included evidence of trespassing, property damage, harassment, and multiple violations of municipal codes. Davis even added emotional distress for good measure. It wasn't about money. I didn't want a dime from Karen. I wanted accountability. For weeks, she had acted like she was above consequences, twisting rules, exploiting loopholes, and playing the victim. Now, the law would finally hold up a mirror. Court was scheduled a month out. In the meantime, I kept the rink closed for repairs. The neighborhood was quieter. Some people avoided eye contact. Others stopped to offer whispered encouragement. "We're rooting for you," one mother said after dropping her kid off at school. "She's made all our lives miserable for years." It was the first time I realized I wasn't the only target. Karen's warpath hadn't just hit me, it had bruised the entire block. But most people had been too afraid or too tired to push back. I had become their symbol of resistance, whether I wanted to be or not. When court day finally arrived, I walked into that courtroom calm and prepared. Karen sat across the aisle in an overly dramatic black dress, clutching tissues and flanked by her attorney. I noticed she kept dabbing her eyes for effect, even though they were bone dry. Her opening argument was a mess of emotional manipulation. She claimed her youngest child had suffered frostbite, though no medical records were provided. She accused me of weaponizing winter, a phrase that made even the judge raise an eyebrow. Then her lawyer tried to pivot to character attacks, accusing me of being antisocial, a loner, even suggesting I had some vendetta against the community. When it was our turn, Davis methodically dismantled each claim. He played video after video showing Karen's trespassing, her salt sabotage, her verbal threats on my porch, and even an HOA board member's email confirming my property was legally compliant. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was the footage of Karen sneaking around the rink at night. As the screen showed her slipping and cursing while pouring salt, the courtroom went utterly silent. The judge asked if she had anything to say. She didn't. Her lawyer tried to object, but it was weak, hollow. The damage was done. The judge ruled in our favor. Karen's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file it again. She was ordered to pay restitution for the damage done to the rink and received a formal warning for trespassing. The ruling also included a provision that if she set foot on my property again without written permission, she would be subject to immediate legal action, including arrest. As the gavel fell, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. Outside the courthouse, I didn't say anything to her. She looked smaller somehow, her bravado cracked. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She just stared at the ground, clutching her purse like it was the only thing holding her together. For a moment, I almost pitied her. But then I remembered the weeks of harassment, the smug laughter as her kids jumped into my pool, the lies, the threats, the property damage. No, I didn't pity her. I was just done letting her take up space in my mind. Back home, I reopened the rink. The repairs had been completed just in time for one last community skate event before the weather turned. This time, I didn't invite everyone. Only the neighbors who had shown kindness and respect. We skated under string lights while soft music played from hidden speakers. Kids laughed, parents sipped cocoa, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt whole again. Karen's house sat dark, curtains drawn. She didn't come out. Maybe she finally understood that control isn't power. Respect is. And respect has to be earned, not demanded. The weeks that followed the court ruling were quiet in a way that felt almost surreal. The kind of quiet you don't trust at first, because you're so used to chaos, to noise, to something going wrong the moment you let your guard down. But as the days passed, it became clear that Karen had finally run out of cards to play. Her house, once the epicenter of unsolicited noise and uninvited chaos, now sat still and somber. Curtains drawn, porch lights off, driveway empty most days. She no longer strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it. No flyers taped to doors, no HOA gossip circles under her leadership. It was like someone had turned down the volume on her life. Whether it was shame, fear of further legal action, or simply the loss of her perceived power, Karen had gone silent. Meanwhile, my ice rink became something much more than a statement. It became a part of the neighborhood's rhythm. What started as a calculated revenge move evolved into a genuine community space. Parents brought their kids after school, couples skated under evening lights, and even a local small business began sponsoring cocoa and snacks on weekends. The skating coach I'd hired was now running regular lessons, and I had set up a booking system so everyone could take turns without the chaos Karen had once brought. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was redemption. I had taken something negative and turned it into something genuinely positive, and everyone noticed. But the most unexpected change came when a local real estate agent named Rachel stopped by one Saturday afternoon during a public skate session. She was dressed professionally, carried a branded leather folder, and walked up to me with the kind of polite curiosity I'd only seen in business deals. She introduced herself, complimented the rink, then asked, very casually, if I'd ever considered renting it out commercially. I thought she was joking at first, but she opened her folder and showed me a list of inquiries from local schools and recreational groups who had heard about the rink and wanted access. She told me she represented a network of clients who were interested in leasing private outdoor recreational spaces for seasonal use. It caught me off guard. This ice rink, born out of spite and frustration, had now become a potential revenue stream. She left her card, and I didn't commit to anything right away. But that night, as I stood out by the rink with a mug of cocoa and watched families glide and laugh across the ice, the idea started to grow in my mind. What if I leaned into this? What if I took the energy I once spent fighting Karen and channeled it into building something sustainable? Something that gave me joy, peace, and, yes, a little income too. I made a few calls, did some research, and by the end of the week, I had a small business plan drafted. It was modest, just a seasonal recreational service, but it was mine. It was built on my terms, on my property, and entirely legal. Around the same time, the HOA sent out a community update. In it was a note about upcoming revisions to the bylaws, including clarified definitions of private versus communal amenities. For the first time, the language made it explicitly clear that private pools, lawns, driveways, and recreational installations were not subject to communal use, regardless of circumstance. The message was clear: what happened with Karen would not be repeated. It felt like a final seal on the ordeal, a formal acknowledgement that the boundaries I had fought for were now respected by policy, not just principle. One afternoon, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw Karen for the first time in weeks. She was in her front yard, hunched over a pile of soggy decorations she was trying to clean up. Her face was tired, drawn, her shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. For a brief second, our eyes met. She didn't scowl. She didn't sneer. She just looked away. No words were exchanged. No drama. Just silence. And that, in its own way, felt like a bigger victory than anything the court had handed me. It meant she had nothing left to say. No more accusations. No more spinning the truth. Just the cold reality of her own actions finally catching up to her. As winter melted into spring, I decided to retire the rink for the season. The equipment was cleaned, stored, and tucked away, ready for next year if I chose to bring it back. My yard returned to its original state, peaceful, quiet, private. But the echoes of what had happened lingered in the best way possible. Neighbors still dropped by to chat, kids waved when they passed, and the HOA no longer treated me like a problem. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. I was someone who had drawn a line and refused to let it be crossed. Someone who had taken nonsense and turned it into something memorable. The last surprise came in the form of an envelope. No return address, just my name scrawled in loose handwriting. I opened it cautiously and found a simple card. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "I was wrong. I pushed too far. I'm sorry." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Karen. I stared at it for a long moment. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel smug. I just felt closure. Real, quiet closure. The kind that doesn't require payback, revenge, or public humiliation. The kind that lets you finally let go. I didn't write back. I didn't acknowledge it. I didn't need to. She had said her piece, and I had lived mine. That was enough. That weekend, I invited a few friends over for a backyard cookout. We grilled burgers, played music, and laughed in the way people do when they know the tension has finally lifted. As the sun set and lights flickered on around the yard, I stood by the fence and looked out over the space where the rink had once been. It was empty now, just grass and quiet. But in my mind, I could still see the skaters, the lights, the joy. And in the distance, the outline of a woman behind her blinds, watching but not interfering. The story of the rink wasn't just about freezing a pool. It was about reclaiming space, redefining peace, and refusing to be bullied by entitlement disguised as community spirit. Karen had tried to force her chaos into my life, and I had responded not with violence or screaming, but with cold, calculated creativity. And in the end, that made all the difference. I took a deep breath, filled my plate with food, and returned to the party. My home was mine again. And for the first time in months, it truly felt like it.